And we will move on to LR28. Senator Hilkeman. Welcome to the Executive Board.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chairman Hughes and members of the committee. My name is Senator Robert Hilkeman, ROBERTHILKEMANN. I represent District 4 in West Omaha. I'm here to introduce LR28. LR28 accomplishes two actions. One, it would rescind and deem null and void any and all resolutions previously passed by the Nebraska Legislature petitioning Congress to call a federal constitutional convention. Two, it establishes a sunset for all resolutions that petition Congress to call a federal constitutional convention passed by the Nebraska Legislature in the current or any subsequent legislative session. The sunset would occur when a convention is not called on or before the 7th anniversary of the date the last legislative vote is taken on any such resolutions. The most recent application in Nebraska was passed more than 40 years ago. None of us who make up the legislature today voted on any of the pending applications. The resolution promotes good governmental practices by cleaning out antiquated resolutions that are treated by law as the will of the current Nebraska legislature and allows future legislatures to approach the possibility of a constitutional convention with a clean slate. As you can see, I think it's rather straightforward type legislation. I do have a handout here with, if you're interested in the 11 pending applications dating back to 1893. We will get, do you have those? They've been, okay, great. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Senator Hilkeman. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Hilker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Hilkeman. Good to see you again on this one. I understand the logic between, on the one hand, having what you term antiquated calls for amendments maybe that are over 100 years old or have already now been, where the Constitution has been amended to incorporate those. But how does that logic then apply to maybe more recent calls, say for a balanced budget amendment that maybe people either don't find antiquated or have not, the Constitution hasn't been amended to include those?
Well, this again is a cleanup type measure, and it's there's nothing to keep a present legislature or future legislature from once again calling attention to the fact of the budget amendment, the balanced budget amendment. I have a feeling there's a whole bunch of Nebraskans don't even realize that this was called for almost 45 years ago.
Thank you. Do you, well, just one other question. What's the logic behind the 7 years, choosing the sunset provision for 7 years versus 10, 5, 20?
Well, if they haven't done it in that 7-year period of time, they're probably not going to get it accomplished. We haven't, that's in the past, but it requires 2/3 of the states to require it to move this forward anyway. So I would be negotiable on that if that would be a stumbling block. But 7 was the years that we chose to come in.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Seeing none, we'll stay for closing.
I'll be here.
Very good. With that, we'll open it up to proponents to LR28. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairman Hughes, members of the committee. My name is Gavin Geis, G-A-V-I-N-G-E-I-S, and I'm the Executive Director for Common Cause Nebraska. We're here to testify in support of LR28. Common Cause is a grassroots nonprofit that is dedicated to upholding the core values of American democracy. To that point, we're issuing our support for LR28 because it's a common sense resolution that will send previous calls Nebraska's made for an Article 5 convention and will include sunsetting provisions for any future calls we'd make. We say it's common sense because in the running of government business, it comes from time to time our responsibility to clean up what we've written in the past. We do this when we change pronouns from he to include every gender. We do this. We did this just recently in the 2020 election cycle when Nebraskans voted to remove the mentions of slavery and of the use of forced labor as punishment for crime. So Nebraskans understand the value in cleaning up our laws, in updating our standards to modern day. This is the same case with LR28. It's simply looking at our past actions as a state, the past resolutions we've made, and saying we should be discussing these today. We shouldn't be allowing for old sections of law passed by legislatures 40 years or more ago dictate the conversations and the position our state will take today. And I will note that cleaning up Article 5 conventions, going back and rescinding these is not out of the norm. Over the past several years, states like Delaware, New Mexico, and Maryland have all done the same thing to rescind their previous calls, even if they are having ongoing discussions around Article 5 conventions. It is the act of going back and saying, this is not our current discussion, and we should update this for our modern standards. The last thing I'll say is that this is a particularly, common cause believes this is a particularly important area of law to clean up because Article 5 conventions, the Constitutional Convention process, is, as a whole, up for debate. It is a legally unknown and precarious area. There are proponents, there are opponents to the issue. Some that would argue you can keep it to one subject matter. Others, like Common Cause, who say there are no legal rules that allow you to do that. And so simply looking from that angle of, is this a legal unknown? Is this a complication? We'd argue that the constitutional conventions that we've called for in the past are past applications should draw additional worry and additional scrutiny from us, simply because we don't know for sure what the process would look like, and we shouldn't hold Nebraska to the standards and to the issues we discussed 100 years ago. We should keep our discussions current, and we should keep those debates before us right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Geis. Are there any questions? Senator Hildreth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, Mr. Geis. You and I have had lots of conversations on Article 5 conventions. I won't rehash those here, but you used similar language, similar, not the same, similar to the antiquated language with cleanup. That was a primary argument I believe you made. I can understand that for the old resolutions, but for, say, for instance, 2010 LR 538, which relates to a balanced budget amendment, how would you respond to the argument that people would not perceive that as a cleanup, but really a policy decision to no longer call for a balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution?
I think that's a completely valid question, right, in the sense of, sure, there are some that have been more recent than those we passed in the early 1900s, but I would also point to the discussion we are having right now as a legislature that involves a balanced budget provision within a new call for an Article 5 convention. So I would point to the discussions we're having today to say we should continue to have those debates. We shouldn't hold ourselves to debates that no one in the legislature had. Even if they do seem recent, we are still having those discussions. A balanced budget amendment hasn't disappeared from our dialogue. It's still there. I just think that those debates should happen today in front of today's legislature and through today's eyes.
So, is there any scholarship that you're aware of that would describe when a call might become stale by virtue of time without the need to rescind?
No. None that I hold to, at least. The scholarship in this area seems to allow for states to jump on board an Article 5 call for as long as it remains on the books of a state. So the things that we have in our books could suddenly become live again. There is no expiration date stamped on these by the Constitution, and as a state we haven't stamped an expiration date on these, so there's no reason to believe that they would expire naturally by any measure, but could be brought up again.
The Nebraska Legislature, as you know, has term limits. So the logic of the logic that I heard you argue, which is we should be doing this with the new legislature, right? When in an era of term limits, that is every 2 years, every 4 years. So isn't the logic of that argument suggest that the sunset ought to be 4 years or 2 years? And if that's true, isn't that really just sort of nullifying Nebraska's ability to participate in an Article 5 process? Because realistically, you can't get 2/3 of the states to join a call in 2 years or 4 years.
So, right, there's a practical argument there. Is it possible to do this in a 7-year period? But I would point to the fact that you are now serving your second 4 years, as are most of the legislators who are elected to this body. They get to serve a second term. They serve for 8 years within this body. So in that 7-year period, you could theoretically, you will have turnover. You will have overlap of new legislators and old legislators. So in a sense, yes, we're adding new members to the body. We're adding different perspectives, but we, as a body, retain a lot of the old. Many legislators don't lose their reelection bid. That's not common in Nebraska. To say that people are serving 2 or 4 years, the reality is they're serving 8 usually, and that a 7-year limit on something like this doesn't seem outside of what we can realistically talk about and have a dialogue on as a state.
So my last question, if I may, Mr. Chairman, is really just it's a question of line drawing. So I understand the line that's being drawn in LR28, and another line would be just to not do anything. I can see the logic of truly cleaning up old, 100-plus-year-old calls or calls that are really rendered not void, but because there's been maybe moot because the Constitution has been amended through other means. If I were to ask you, and I know you're arguing for this line, but if I were to ask you to draw a line somewhere in between LR28 and no line at all that would capture true cleanups, how would you draw that line?
I would keep the line where LR28 keeps up, because I believe we should start fresh. I think if we're going to establish sunsetting provisions, if we're going to establish limitations around Article 5 convention calls in Nebraska, we should start now. We shouldn't point to some theoretical point in the past to say that's when it begins, but today should be, honestly, simply because it's the easiest, but also because it's fair. It's fair to all of the previous calls that we would rescind and start now, set sunset provisions now, instead of, like you said, drawing some arbitrary line in the past that people are going to disagree on.
But that line wouldn't, sorry, Mr. Chairman, but that line would not then, that would include within that sweeping away LR 538, which is a reaffirmation of a previous LR, right?
So you're referencing is that the 2010?
I'm sorry, I've got Senator Hilton's very helpful chart. I mean, you don't, I apologize.
Making sure we're talking about the same thing. So that's the 2010 reaffirmation of a previous call, right, for the body's budget?
Yes, that's right.
And that would be included in the rescission by this bill,
right,
correct?
and the line you're drawing, the fact that it's been reaffirmed recently within the last 12 years by this legislature,
right,
that would still, you think that line should be still drawn where that, even though the reaffirmation, if it was reaffirmed still.
If it falls within within the window we're setting, right? If we're saying it's 7 years, if we're saying it's 10 years, that no matter how we look at that reaffirmation, it was 2010, that is more than the 7-year sunsetting that's being proposed here. Even if we increase that sunsetting to a 10-year provision, it would include that. So I understand the tension with this particular resolution and why it is a sticking point for the body right now. But it seems immensely arbitrary to say that one is special in some way and should be excluded from cleaning up, simply because it was kind of recent. Now, if this bill included a 20-year provision, 10-year provision, 15, does that make sense?
I follow your argument. I disagree with it, to be candid, but I follow your argument. Yeah, thank you.
That's
it does
your
make sense. Thank you, Mr. Geis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Any other
We've missed our
questions?
discussions.
Whoa, Mr. Geis, please, if you don't mind. Senator Lowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Gavin, good to see you.
Two, sir.
Are there other states that have sunsets on the resolutions?
Other states that have sunsets, I believe in the states that I listed, they've included sunset provisions on their future ones. I can find that fact for sure for you to make sure that they didn't exclude that, but that's been a pretty key provision and a key part of the rescission in other states like Delaware, New Mexico, Maryland. But I will make sure that that is included and hasn't been cut.
Okay.
Very good. Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Geis.
Thank you.
Next proponent. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Hughes, members of the Executive Board. My name is Renee Fry, I'm R-E-N-E-E-F-R-Y. I'm the Executive Director of Open Sky Policy Institute here in support of LR28. A lot of my testimony has already been covered, so I'm going to skip down, and I also want to address the conversation about LR 528, or 538, excuse me. We are concerned for a number of the reasons that have been brought before you about cleaning out antiquated resolutions. But we also are concerned about a balanced budget amendment, which would worsen economic downturns and reduce federal funding that many Nebraskans benefit from. We agree that it is really critical to use care with taxpayer dollars at all levels of government. However, 1,000 economists have found that actually a balanced budget would make recessions deeper and longer. And it would eliminate the federal government's ability to go into debt, which stabilizes the economy during recessionary downturns, such as what we're facing now. It would also have severe consequences for nearly all Nebraskans by reducing federal government support for communities throughout the state, including farmers, including retirees and veterans. In FY19, federal dollars accounted for more than 27% of appropriations of all fund sources in Nebraska and 31.5% during the Great Recession in FY09. I do want to stress why this matters now. There is an active effort to aggregate applications for a balanced budget amendment and combine those with plenary applications to call for an unlimited convention in an effort to reach the required 34-state threshold. So if the strategy succeeds, Nebraska could serve as a tipping point for whether a convention is called or not, as 27 states have an active BBA and an additional 6 states have plenary applications. Promptly rescinding our state's outdated applications would move us further away from that threshold and ensure that Congress cannot call a constitutional convention. I would note also that if a constitutional convention were called, that Congress would set the rules for that convention. Nebraska wouldn't be alone in rescinding prior Article 5 convention applications, as Gavin stated. Nevada would be added to the list of states that he mentioned earlier. In terms of LR 538, so I've read the transcript, and when you read the transcript, you see actually Senator Haar starts out and he's very adamantly opposed to LR 538. He's asking lots of questions, and then all of a sudden, so there's this rigorous debate going on, and all of a sudden it stops. So I thought this is really bizarre, and they move forward to a vote. So I went and asked what happened, and I talked to a couple senators, and I talked to the clerk, and what I found out was that basically they had been advised that it didn't have any legal standing. And so reaffirming the BBA was actually just a political statement. Didn't have any legal standing, didn't go to Congress, and so they determined that, what the heck, we can always tell the federal government that they need to, spend more wisely. So that's what happened. And with that, I see my time's up. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Ms. Fry. Are there questions from the committee? Senator Hilgers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I've got a question, but let me first say thank you for the history on that. I do appreciate that very much. I know you and I have dialogued about this issue before, and I do appreciate the candor in that. A big part of the support of, from what I hear, a significant portion of the support for this resolution, the prior ones, is because of the concern of the balanced budget amendment. Is that right?
It is.
In the absence of that amendment, so if we were to take that out and we're just in a theory abstract stage, is there a line that we could draw that would clean up old amendments and not maybe capture recent ones that were 5 or 6 years ago? Is there a reasonable line to draw, or is that just LR28 in your view?
I think it's really important for the current legislature to be voting on these and to have a stake in them. There are states where they have rescinded their applications and then come back and passed a BBA, and that would be up to the legislature to determine, but at least they had the opportunity to weigh in, and so those were two separate events. They did a full rescission and then came back. And that way you would actually give the current legislature the ability to have a say. If I understand your point about 7 years, I think if you went to 9 years, you would make sure that you would have a completely new legislature with the exception of anyone who may have returned, such as Senator Lathrop. But I do think it's important because these calls stay on the books for a very, very long time, but the current legislature has had a say and is actively engaged and wants to continue to ask Congress for that call. Because as we know, things change, right? We have a new administration now, and so things are ever evolving, and I think it's really important that the legislature is up to date on these calls.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? Seeing none, thank you, Ms. Fry.
Thank you.
Any additional proponents to LR28? Anyone wishing to testify as an opponent to LR28? Anyone wishing to testify in the neutral capacity? Seeing none, Senator Hilkeman, you're welcome to close. While you're coming up, we do have position letters as a proponent from Kelly Keller, National Association of Social Workers, proponent Kathy Wilmot, proponent Shirley Niemeyer, opponent David McPhillips, and opponent F. John Howard. Senator Hilkeman.
So just wrap it up. Other states have rescinded their past applications. Other states have reapplied, adopted new applications. This continues to do the same thing for Nebraska. We can do that. This is not unprecedented in any way, and I'd ask you to move forward on LR28.
Very good. Any questions for the senator? Seeing none, thank you, Senator Hilkeman. That will close our hearing today on LR28, and we are adjourned.